So this Shabbos is an important one in this country and hopefully for the world. Tomorrow marks the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington that took place in August of 1963. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. In this week's Parsha, there's one of the, I think, the most interesting verses that also describes how the system of halakha develops, but also has so many deep things to teach us. So I want to look at it very briefly, although this could be taught for many days, but for purposes of tonight's drashah. Ki tivneh bayit chadash. When you build a new house, we're told, and remember my Drash last week, there are some things that are really understandable in our, was that last week? Okay, thank you. I knew it was sometime in the past. There are things that are really understandable in our sacred text, and there are things that are really hard to understand, and both categories deserve a lot of grappling. So you'll let me know what you think of this one. It's remarkable that this is, of course, in our text, and I've actually spoken about it in other years because there's so much richness in this verse. So when you build yourself a new house, V'asita ma'akeh leganecha. You should make on your house a ma'akeh, which is a word that's not used anywhere else in the Bible, in the Chumash, and we understand it to mean a parapet or some kind of low fence around the top of the roof. Do we have any architects here? Kenneth, you're an architect? I didn't know you're an architect. I knew Kenneth was. So that's the architectural bench back there. So this is an architectural rule that whenever you build a house, the zoning requirements are you have to build a parapet, a low wall or a fence around the roof. Why? Velo tasim damim. You should not have the responsibility of what in this phrase means like a blood guilt, the responsibility of blood being shed because somebody falls from the roof. This is remarkable, right? This is an ancient text that tells us when you build a house what the requirements are for safety. That when you build a house, you have to anticipate the possibility that somebody drunk might go up on the top of your roof and fall off. And guess what? It's your responsibility if they do. Now, I know if I opened this up to the lawyers, I've had this discussion with lawyers, there's a lot of interesting things in American law that exist around kind of things like you have to build a fence around a pool, right? You're responsible for if somebody falls into a pool. I can't think of other things, but I'm sure there's other things in American law. We've got some. So you're responsible if some schnook goes up to the top of your roof, acts inappropriately, but because you didn't build a low fence or a low wall, not a fence, a low wall around the roof, you bear responsibility. So halakha spends a lot of time with this verse to expand and from this verse, expand all different concepts of what is required of our behavior. So there are obvious things about this. We're not supposed to do anything that would create a situation in which somebody could hurt themselves because of something we did. We're supposed to anticipate. We're supposed to imagine, and the Talmud goes through many different examples, which I'm not going to do tonight, of examples of the ways this elevates our behavior in the world. We have to anticipate somebody acting badly or inappropriately, and have we done everything we can so that their blood is not on us? This obviously has huge implications for all different things, right? We're not supposed to, according to Jewish business law, and I taught a whole class on this once, some of you might remember, you're not supposed to say something about a job that's not exactly true if somebody's going to take the job in either direction. You can't falsely encourage a workplace to hire somebody, and you can't tell somebody something about a job that isn't true because they might be hurt by that. This extends to language, how we speak about things, how people will understand what we say. Will they be hurt by something they would do because of how we would describe something? This, I think, is I'm fascinated by this because it means as a society, we have to think about the ways that people are hurt because we as a society don't create things to protect them. There are so many obvious examples of that tonight I don't have time to go through it, but the one I want to discuss a little bit is the issue about racism in the world. And you see, it puts the obligation to protect people not on the person who's the drunk guy who goes to the top of the roof, but on the person who builds the actual building. That we as a society have an obligation to think about how those who are most vulnerable will be hurt by the systems that we create, that society creates. And that we're not exempt even if we didn't do it ourselves. That's an incredible concept. Obviously, it's a burden and a responsibility on how a society is constructed. And this is something that Dr. Martin Luther King understood deeply when he talked about the debt that America owed to African Americans. This isn't a favor. This isn't charity. This isn't being nice. This is a debt that is owed. And all that we can do to pay that debt as a society will be what it means to live in a just world. So tonight I want to just speak very briefly about this March on Washington with this pasuk in my mind, how in every generation there are people who rise up despite the current circumstances and somehow rise beyond them to have insight about what is just behavior. It's never pure, it's never perfect. I mean, no women spoke at the 1963 March on Washington. Let's be clear about that. This was, as we know, this struggle for civil rights was not necessarily a struggle that understood women's rights and feminism, and in many ways feminism came out of that civil rights movement. Lack of perspective on that. Not a single woman spoke. Some were scheduled to sing and didn't sing because they arrived late. There's a lot of interesting backstory to the March on Washington. But what was that March on Washington, and why was it significant? And what was the Jewish voice which found itself at the center there? So in 1941, A. Philip Randolph, Jason, do we have a picture of A. Philip Randolph? This is A. Philip Randolph, one of the greatest Americans whom very few people know of today. A. Philip Randolph was the executive director, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was the largest union of African American, mostly men in America. And he was the voice for the working class African Americans. He was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He said in 1941 that he was going to gather hundreds of thousands of people on the Mall in Washington, D.C., to demand that all the jobs in the New Deal, which were segregated and racist, be open to African Americans, and that all the jobs in the defense industry be integrated, and that African Americans could work in all these great new jobs that the New Deal that FDR created. And he said in 1941 he was going to have a march for jobs and justice on the Mall in Washington, D.C. as an economic justice issue. He said, we can't only talk about civil rights. This is 1941. The day before the march took place, FDR said that he would issue an executive order to eliminate discrimination in the Defense Department jobs. And he created something called the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which was basically a precursor of the EEOC. And A. Philip Randolph called off the march. In 1946, the Fair Employment Practices Committee was dissolved. Racism, of course, was alive and well in the 50s. And then the civil rights movement started emerging bigger and bigger in the 50s. And then in 1961, A. Philip Randolph called for another March on Washington. And this time, his assistant at the Brotherhood of the Brotherhood of the Porters. What did I just say? Yeah. Oh my, the sleeping car porters was Bayard Rustin. Worked in that, and this is a picture of Bayard Rustin, the gay African-American hero who was the one who really taught Martin Luther King about the concept of nonviolence and of passive resistance, because he himself was a pacifist. and he was deeply influenced by Gandhi, but he was arrested in 1953 for having sex in the back of a car in Los Angeles with another man. And because of that morals charge, which was on his record, he was never allowed to have a very visible role in the civil rights movement. So Philip Randolph was officially the organizer of the March on Washington, but Bayard Rustin was number 2, and he was now the generation which organized that March on Washington. Bayard Rustin, by the way, his partner of many years is still alive, who is much younger than Bayard Rustin, Walter Nagel, and he lives in Penn South. And if one can see him all around New York at various events all the time. So Bayard Rustin was the great organizer with Philip Randolph of the 1963 March. And you had the traditional civil rights organizations and the labor movement coming together to create a march which said, there is no elimination of racism without economic justice. And it was called, that 1963 March, for Jobs and Justice because of this deep root. And it was the labor movement, which is not very well known, which funded the March on Washington. The UAW in particular, the AFT, the UAW under Walter Reuther, who was the great union leader of the time, literally funded the March on Washington. So that was 1963 in the midst of the struggles for economic justice and to eliminate racism. Tonight I want to focus very briefly on the Jewish voice that was there at the March on Washington. And I always say this is the most important rabbi's sermon ever given that nobody knows about, because he had the how shall we say, the zechut to give his talk right before Dr. King's I Have a Dream talk. So nobody remembers what the rabbi said on the March on Washington, but I want us to, on this eve of the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. Rabbi Joachim Prince was one of the greatest rabbis, and this is a picture of him at the March on Washington. Joachim Prince was a German Jew. He was the rabbi in Berlin through the 1930s, and he and his family were thrown out in the time that the Nazis, before the World War II, they were actually trying to get Jews to leave Germany. And Joachim Prince, who was a very loud anti-Nazi activist from 1929 on, he was thrown out, thank God, from the country with his wife and his children, and he moved to the United States and became the rabbi of one of the most important synagogues on the East Coast, Temple B'nai Abraham in Newark, New Jersey, and this is what it looked like. It still exists. It became a church, and this it had a sanctuary that seated 2,000 people, swimming pool, huge ballroom, huge, you can see, look at this, fantastic. The structure was built in the early 20s. The synagogue is from the 1850s. And Newark, New Jersey was the center of a lot of Jewish life. But guess what the Jews did, of course, like many of our families, left the urban centers exactly at the moment when these urban centers needed Jews to stay. We as a community abandoned the cities, including Newark, especially after the riots in 1967, but not only. And so ironically, Jews were so active in the civil rights movement, but in so many deep ways we have real responsibility for what we did in the abandoning of urban centers. So this was Rabbi Prince's great synagogue. His music director was Helfman, whose music we sing a lot of here. That was his music director. And this synagogue would be a 2,000-seat synagogue. The people would get there at 7 o'clock in the morning for a 9 o'clock service because it would be sold out every single Shabbat. This was Joachim Prince, and he very quickly became very involved in civil rights movement. He said, I saw what happened in Berlin. I know what happens when a people are targeted, and I will not be silent. And he became the president of the American Jewish Congress. Long story, American Jewish Committee, German Jews, much more traditional, much more conservative. American Jewish Congress was founded during the early 40s to be for Eastern European Jews, much more progressive. He, although he was a German Jew, was the president of American Jewish Congress, and became very involved in the fight for civil rights. So when Dr. King was looking to have a Jewish voice at the March on Washington, it was Rabbi Joachim Prince who was the speaker. And this is the actual program, not actually who spoke, but the original program, because guess what? Marian Anderson was a little late, so she didn't actually sing, and some of the speakers couldn't find the stage. So this wasn't exactly who spoke, but it's fantastic to see the program for the original program for the 1963 March on Washington, as you could see, for jobs and freedom. And now I want to offer some of Rabbi Prince's actual words. We owe it to remember him. He was the rabbi there for many years, and he died in the late 70s. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which make a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring to this great demonstration, in which thousands of us proudly participate, a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. And in this, Prince is saying that our commitment to social justice comes from history and from theology, from God's demand of us. In the realm of the spirit, our ancestors taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. From our Jewish historic experience of 3,500 years, we say, our ancient history began with slavery and the yearning for freedom. During the Middle Ages, my people lived for 1,000 years in the ghettos of Europe. Our modern history begins with the proclamation of emancipation. It is for these reasons that it is not merely sympathy and compassion for the black people of America that motivates us. It is above all and beyond all such sympathies and emotion a sense of complete identification and solidarity born of our own painful historic experience. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, and the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. Not merely black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act, from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the black person, not for the sake of the black community, but for the sake of the idea and the aspiration of America itself. Our children, yours and mine in every school across the land, each morning pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands. They, the children, speak fervently and innocently of this land as the land of liberty and justice of all. The time, I believe, has come to work together, for it is not enough to hope together. It is not enough to pray together. To work together that this children's oath, pronounced every morning from Maine to California, from north to south, may become a glorious, unshakable reality in a morally renewed and united America. And we stand on the shoulders of people like Rabbi Joachim Prince, and we need to remember him as one of the great heroes of our people. King then got up to speak, and his speech was supposed to be 4 minutes long, but it lasted in his I Have His Dream speech, it lasted 16 minutes. And those 16 minutes have really changed the world. These words remain so deeply meaningful to us today. We're not just about observing a historical moment of the March on Washington. It continues to be a clarion call for all of us. And as King has said, and we've so deeply learned from, I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. So let us, in their memories, keep creating this world, this society, built on love with parapets everywhere to protect the vulnerable.